Hello and welcome to Racecraft again for part 3 of our Scorpion build. Now in the last video I talked about this diff and how the diff was at the wrong angle and I made those top arms. Well, the top arms aren't bolted in yet. Also in that video I said that it was a nice job. Well, the more I look at this diff, the less enamored with it I am. And a case in point there is these brackets that were welded onto the diff. I've cut them off, but these brackets were here and they're for the handbrake cable. Now the original handbrake cable is this here and it runs across the back of the diff and it actually pulls on the little arms on the original calipers. But they're not the original calipers. Whoever built this diff put these EA, EB disc brakes on the back. They're Ford brakes on a Ford diff, so I guess that makes sense. But why put these brackets on for the Mitsubishi brakes? So the Mitsubishi pulls the cable this way, but these pull towards the front of the car. But then there's another problem. In order to accommodate the calipers, they've welded this big chunk of quarter plate onto the back of the diff here and moved the pin that mounts the shock absorber. So the shocks actually come in about 40-50 mil, so it misses the caliper. But in order to support the shock absorber, this big piece of quarter's been welded on here. So when I went to have a look at where the cable could go, there was nowhere for the cable to go. So what I've done is I've hole sawed a hole through the bracket here, put a piece of tube in there, flared the edges of the tube out, so that I can bring the cable through and hook it up. Now if we go to the other side, you can see the cable's in there. It's not attached to the arm just yet. I've still got to put an adjuster on the end of the cable. But it's all pretty tight in there. But we have to actually cut holes through there. Now, the funny thing about this, or the stupid thing about this, is that they could simply have put the brakes on the front of the diff. Not move the shock absorber, not weld this big bracket on here and all that sort of thing, and the cables would still have come out the front. Now, speaking of cables, I'm fortunate that I make my own handbrake cables. Now this car had a single handbrake cable on it. The cable came out, went across the back of the diff, joined to two cables, and it pulled sideways across the diff. But now that we've got two calipers with two cables, I've had to run the two cables up inside the car and make some bracketry inside, so when you pull a handbrake on it pulls two cables on. But I'll show you that in a moment. These two brackets, they've also been welded on in strange places. One here is right close to the pumpkin, this one's a mile away from it, and there are two different heights. And this arm here has got an S-bend in it to make it line up with this bracket. I don't understand why all these brackets are welded on in funny angles and so forth. Also on this diff, you'll see this bush is at a big angle to the bracket. And the reason why it's at an angle is because it's been cut and welded. It's not even a very nice weld job. This is the bracket that I made to bring the two handbrake cables in. So you can see the outer cables are anchored there. We actually used a little T-piece off the back of the diff to join the two cables together. And then the single cable just goes up to the handbrake itself. So luckily, a pretty simple conversion there. The two cables fitted through the original hole here. That was big enough, so that was quite handy. So once the carpet's over this, you won't even see it. I've got the electric power steering column mounted in. You can see the electric motor there. It's tucked up out of the way, doesn't get in the road of anything. Already run the wiring through. It runs underneath the left-hand mudguard so you can't see it, and it's a nice big heavy-duty cable. You've got to run a big heavy wires to this because they do draw a fair bit of current when they're running. That's the original wires there, so you can see how heavy they are. So we'll put all the plastic bits back on again, and that's that side of that done. I'd really hoped by this time that I would have this motor in the car. Unfortunately, we've run into a bit of a hitch, and the hitch is the gearbox. Now, the owner of the car bought off Gumtree what he thought was an AOD gearbox. This is what an AOD looks like, but unfortunately that's not what he got sent. The seller told him it was an AOD, he paid good money for it, and he got ripped off. And I really hate these scumbags on, whether it's eBay or Gumtree or wherever, that don't do the right thing. But in a moment, I'll show you what he actually ended up getting. So this is what he ended up getting. This is a C6, definitely not an AOD. You can see the difference in shape and length and all sorts of things. Now, I know nothing about this gearbox, apart from the fact that it's a C6. Some of these C6s had a peculiar valve body in them where they took off in second gear. And if you wanted to take off in first gear, you had to manually pull it down to first gear and hold it in first gear. So until we pull the gearbox apart, we don't even know what we've got. But very, very disappointing that someone would rip somebody off intentionally like that and sell them this piece of garbage instead of what he asked for. So yesterday we bolted this gearbox up to the motor and put it into the car. This is the C6, and it really doesn't fit into the tunnel. It came close. We even cut a little bit of the casting off here to try and fit it in a little bit better. I took the kick down arm off it, but it was close everywhere and all sorts of things hit. The servo on this side, that hit the floor, so we would have had to have beaten the floor in there. Where the shifter's going to go, we'd have to beat the floor in there. The gear shift came down, it was right in front of the speedo, and it was very, very close in this area here. So it would be so much work to put this C6 in, we've decided not to do it. So what I've got here is a C4, and you can see it's a way smaller gearbox. That's going to be so much easier to get into the car. So that's the way we're going to go. So we'll get that bolted into the car and get everything set up. Then that'll go off to get reconditioned, and that's what we're going to run with. So this is what the C4 looks like bolted in. This isn't the same C4 we had on the floor, but it is the same kind of gearbox. But you can see we've got a ton of room around it. It fits into the tunnel. We've got plenty of room for the gear shift. We've got plenty of room for the shifter and for our speedo drive, everything. There's room everywhere. So the C4 is definitely the way to go. The reason we're going to the C4 is because we can't find an AOD. The owner would love to have an AOD in it, but maybe that's something that'll come up later on, and we'll swap it at a later stage. Anyway, that's about it for this time. Next time we should have radiator in and all that sort of thing. So thanks for tuning in.